When most of us think about the automotive nameplate Cavalier, this is the vehicle that comes to mind, Chevrolet's J car. It was introduced in 1982 and produced through around 2005, at least in the U.S. The Cavalier was kind of a nondescript compact car for General Motors and part of that overall J platform lineup, which included not only the Cavalier, but the J2000, later Sunbird, Olds Forenza, Buick Skyhawk, and of course, the infamous or famous Cadillac Cimarron, depending upon how you wanted to look at it. And while the Cavalier was certainly a vehicle that sold in high volumes over many years for General Motors, what many don't know is the Cavalier name was actually used in a number of other instances prior to General Motors picking it up for the 1982 Chevrolet vehicle that we just described. In fact, I believe that it was Packard that originally placed the Cavalier name on a vehicle in the mid-1950s. And of course, by the time General Motors picked up the nameplate in 1982, well, Packard was obviously gone, so there was nobody to sue them. However, another automobile company picked up the name Cavalier and used it on a very interesting concept car in the mid-1960s, and that was American Motors. Now, before I get into showing pictures of the AMC Cavalier, let's take a look for a moment here at this photo of a 1970 AMC Hornet, one of the most recognizable American Motors vehicles because AMC, frankly, sold so many Hornets over the vehicle's lifetime. And in fact, the Hornet and a number of elements of it really lived on for many years post the Hornet nameplate being sunset. For example, though 1977 was the last year that the Hornet was produced, the Hornet and a number of its components, actually many of its components, gave rise to the subsequent AMC Concorde in 1978 and then the AMC Eagle in 1980. You can see in particular that the doors and the roofline, the windshield as an example, were all similar on the Hornet as well as the Concorde and the Eagle. In fact, the original Concorde was really forced to use a fair amount of the Hornet sheet metal, and AMC just simply didn't have enough tooling dollars to change it over as fast as they had wanted. And so you notice that the Concorde styling evolves front and rear in 1978. There's relatively minor changes and updates versus the Hornet. Then to 1979, where the front end changes on the Concorde to the dual headlight design. Then in the rear, where the rear changes over to what would later be seen on the Eagle and the Concordes until they were both sunset in the 1980s. And of course, who could forget that 1 year after the Hornet was introduced, a infamous AMC vehicle would be spawned from the Hornet's platform, the shorter wheelbase, the 96-inch wheelbase as opposed to the 108-inch wheelbase of the Hornet, AMC Gremlin, which effectively used the sheet metal for the front half of it from the Hornet and then kind of had this chopped off rear end that some loved, some hated. And the Gremlin really lived on past its 1977 model year lifetime when that ended, into the AMC Spirit liftback and even the AMC Eagle comeback. So it had really a long lifetime, and the beauty of the Hornet was that it shared quite a few components with other AMC cars that were larger than it. So this was a benefit as well as a challenge for AMC because, of course, if a component has to fit on a Hornet, as well as an example, a Matador or an Ambassador, it generally has to be made heavier. So their smaller cars tended to be heavier than other similar subcompact vehicles in the Gremlin class or the compact vehicles in the Hornet class. However, let's return to a photo of this 1970 Hornet and just permanently etch that styling into your mind. And now let's talk about the AMC Cavalier, as you see here, which, wow, it looks pretty similar to the Hornet. Well, in any case, this is where AMC would get its styling, or a number of the styling cues for the Hornet from this concept that was introduced in the 1966 model year. When the Cavalier was introduced, it was one of four vehicles, part of what AMC dubbed Project 4, that toured the show circuit in 1966. And as a consequence, you can imagine if it's called Project 4, that must mean that there are four show cars, and indeed there were. There was this AMC Cavalier, there was the Vixen, which you see here. Then there was, I think, a pretty gorgeous AMX prototype. And again, this is before the actual AMX was launched. So the AMX here, the X stood for experimental. And it kind of was a preview of what would come. And then there was the AMX2 that you can see here as well. I think also quite beautiful. The AMX would clearly spawn the, AMX. But the interesting thing about this concept was that it had what AMC called a ramble seat, kind of like a rumble seat. But of course, this was based off the Rambler platform, and you could put the backlight up, and then you had a rumble seat for passengers to sit in. Remember, this was devised during the time of the Mustang, where there was a desire to have a number of so-called 2+2 compact, sporty vehicles. And AMC really didn't have anything, and they were late to the party when it came to copying the Mustang. So this concept was at least one that kind of trended in that direction. I think the most beautiful, frankly, of all the Project 4 concepts was the AMX2 that you see here, the notchback coupe that on the body side, it kind of has, let's say, visions of the 1966 Tornado with those wheel arches that are a little bit toned down. But the wheel arches kind of continue all the way down the body side, just like they do in the 1966 Tornado. There is an interesting and innovative feature here, and that is this full-width horizontal grille with the electric shaver, I guess you could call it, look to it, and hidden headlights. And that theme is kind of carried over in the body side with those lower strakes that would later be copied perhaps by a number of other automobile companies, including Ford and maybe even Mercedes. I'm stretching a bit on the latter, but in any event, go with me. Let's return to talking about the AMC Cavalier that we originally started out with. So leave it to AMC to develop, let's call it one of the most cost-efficient concept vehicles of all time, and to really put cost at the center of their concept vehicles. Now, it's no secret that throughout its lifetime, AMC was often capital constrained. And what does that mean? It really means that it just didn't have a lot of money to retool new vehicles. In other words, to buy equipment, to make new vehicles, and make the new sheet metal associated with them, or other components too. And this was really just a function of the company's continuing, waxing and waning of its fortunes, let's say. And thus, AMC's designers, led by future studio chief Dick Teague, decided to come up with a concept car where the overall premise of the vehicle was a car where AMC could save a large amount of tooling expense in the event that it were to be produced. Now, tooling, you can imagine, is something that you have to buy up front for a particular vehicle. So you're buying it up front, you get the revenues and the profits associated with the vehicle later. So there's a lot of capital or cash outlay associated with the tooling. And that was one of the premises, that this car was really trying to minimize the tooling cost so that it didn't significantly impact AMC's cash flow. And the goal was to have a car where the tooling cost would be about 60% of the average for a vehicle. So if the tooling costs were $100 million, this vehicle would have tooling costs of $60 million. So how did the designers translate this goal into a concept car? Well, take a look at the vehicle here, and I will just say that there are a lot of pieces of sheet metal that only need to be tooled once, despite the fact that they find themselves on multiple places in the car. So the first thing is that the doors are not just specific to their unique position, but in fact, the driver's side front door, as an example, is directly interchangeable with the passenger side rear. And the passenger side front door is directly interchangeable with the driver's side rear. This was not the first time this had been done. Cord actually did something similar with its vehicles previously, but again, you can imagine here you only have to tool 2 doors as opposed to 4, so that saves a significant amount of money. The same was also true for the fenders and rear quarters. So the driver's side front fender was interchangeable with the passenger side rear quarter panel, and the passenger side front fender was interchangeable with the driver's side rear quarter panel. So again, you only have to tool up 2 different pieces of sheet metal here versus 4. I think more innovative feature was that the hood and the deck lid were also shared. That is the same piece of sheet metal for the hood as well as the deck lid. But Dick Teague came up with this ingenious idea to give the roofline these flying buttresses, such that in side profile, it gave the car this long hood, short deck profile, and it disguised the fact that the rear deck was actually the exact same as the hood. I thought that was just overall genius move, let's say. And then also, the bumpers were the same on the front and the rear. Now, clearly, some of this, the overall styling theme translated at least somewhat to the AMC Hornet. You can see in the front end a lot of similarities between the Cavalier styling and the Hornet. And in fact, the Hornet, I believe, did use the same stamping for the front and rear bumpers, but there were no suicide doors on the Hornet, which would have been required to execute the door interchangeability, and the fenders and rear quarters were not interchangeable. So that concept really was left on the cutting room floor. One of the major reasons for this was because of the way the car was architected, there apparently was a decent size intrusion of the front wheels and the wheelhouses intruding into the passenger compartment. So if you were sitting in the driver's seat, there wasn't as much room as one would hope for your left foot, as an example, because that wheelhouse was kind of making its way into the passenger compartment. Interestingly, this was a feature that many people had dealt with for a long time on vans, as an example. But apparently, according to Dick Teague, AMC's chief engineer, or one of its chief engineers, was really just opposed to this concept because he really, in Dick Teague's terms, couldn't figure out where to put the dimmer switch. And I'm not kidding when I say that. Apparently, this was one of the big issues associated with executing the concept and why it didn't come through to production. Of course, by this point, the dimmer switch on many different vehicles had been placed on the steering column, at least for European vehicles. And of course, that's where it is today. And really, that's where it would be, even starting in the 1970s on some vehicles for General Motors, as an example, like the Pontiac Grand Am, as well as the Oldsmobile Cutlass Salon. But this became such an issue for AMC's engineers, they just decided that they could not execute this car, and so the overall design and the thought process behind it was scrapped. It's really rather unfortunate because I think the Cavalier is, a pretty good-looking car overall. It does have a little bit of a strange look to that midsection there, with the rear door seemingly to be a bit out of proportion and rather large, but that's just a result of the interchangeable body panels. I do think it's humorous that the car had 13-inch mag wheels. I suspect that part of the reason for the smallish wheels was that AMC designers were really trying to get a car like this into production, and given the complaints of the engineering team that the wheelhouse was intruding into the passenger compartment, they probably put smaller wheels on it to try to minimize that intrusion. I think I've heard and read that some of the earlier versions of the concept had bigger wheels, which intruded even more into the passenger compartment, and that was just a non-starter. So, today you see a lot of wheels that are over 20 inches. On concept cars back in this time frame, you had wheels that were just 13 inches. Overall, the Cavalier was an interesting styling study, and like I said, you can see that a number of the styling elements made its way through the Hornet. But aside from that, it really was kind of dead on arrival for the reasons mentioned. I have to say that I think it's only AMC that would come up with a concept car that was focused on minimizing cost. Usually concept cars are vehicles that are supposed to reach out into the future in an unconstrained version. And here the designers purposely put a constraint on themselves to, try to get something into production that would have been responsible in the context of AMC's overall financials. And I have to applaud them for that as a bean counter. I do also like the, kind of funky door handles that were flush with the body on this Cavalier concept. And you notice that it's pretty devoid of overall ornamentation and very clean body sides on this car, which was not typical for American vehicles during this time frame, even American Motors cars during this time frame. So the designers were truly reaching when they developed this concept. But while I could certainly talk more about this particular concept and how it came to fruition and some of the challenges associated with it, I think it's even better if you hear from the designer himself, former AMC chief designer Dick Teague, here in this excerpt from an interview where he talks about the Cavalier and why it didn't make it through to production and what the overall thoughts were of the design team when they came up with it. Let's listen in to the conversation.
Now, the Cavalier was a pet project that I'd been working on for quite a while, with Michigan, as a matter of fact. In fact, I threw this one at him one day, and he about quit on the spot with me, but he finally put his shoulder to the wheel, and we got it going, and it was kind of an interesting vehicle, and it turned out to have a very definite influence on the Hornet. As it turned out, it really became the Hornet. So the Ramble Seat AMX became the two-passenger AMX, and the Cavalier, as it was called, became really the design concept for the Hornet. And the Cavalier was a rather unusual car because I've always been involved in being painfully aware of the cost of tooling anything. I felt that if we could come up with a car that would almost literally cut the cost of tooling an automobile in half, or at the very worst 60% of what it would cost normally. Pick a figure, 10 million to be 6 million, it's 100 million to be 60. So that sort of thing, I felt that we could lop off at least 40% on the body tooling, bumpers, of a vehicle by coming up with a vehicle. And I named that one too, the Cavalier. I didn't name some of the cars, but that one I named. And we called it the Cavalier, which was later picked up by GM, as you know, and Chevrolet. But and we should have sued them for that one, but we didn't.
Did you have a register?
But, well, we couldn't, because in my Packard days, I called a Packard a Cavalier, Cavalier 300. So it had been used before, so we couldn't sue anybody. In fact, the Packard's still been around. They sued us, I guess. But so this car was as follows. It was I call it an interchangeable car, and what it was a four-door sedan that only tooled two doors. I don't know if you remember this one or not.
I'm not sure.
The left front, the driver's door, was interchangeable, dead interchangeable with the right rear door. The left rear door was interchangeable with the right front door. The left front fender was interchangeable with the right rear fender. The left rear fender was interchangeable with the right front fender. The hood was interchangeable with the deck. And the bumpers were interchangeable front and rear.
Was this your innovation?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And it very nearly happened. It did happen conceptually, because if I showed you pictures of that car, and I've got them somewhere because I'm moving, as you know, you will see that definite and distinct resemblance to the 70 Hornet. And this was 4 years before. But it really did set the pattern, looks-wise, appearance-wise, styling-wise, for the Hornet. But the Hornet was not interchangeable, as you know.
What would your engineers have thought of this? Or did you
Well, that was one of my problems. We had a guy who's gone now by the name of Ralph Esbrandt, and we used to call him Dr. No, or Isn't Brandt, because everything that you'd show Ralph, he would have 16 different reasons why you couldn't do it. And God rest his soul, literally, he was a neat guy, and he was a fine Christian guy, and he had lots of super virtues. But I'll tell you, being agreeable or being open-minded about a new idea, he wasn't. He was a very, very tough customer with styling. And part of my serious problems over there was in trying to convince Ralph that it was either his idea and we ought to build it because of that, or that it was something that somebody else had done. That it was. But if it came out of styling, AM styling, he was a gimmick without even seeing it.
Is it E-S-B-R-A-N?
I-S-B-R-A-N-D-T.
Good. Thank you.
But nice guy, and he's gone now. But he was an awful tough customer to try to talk in anything that was a little different, unique.
And he wasn't.
And he said about whenever you'd give him a suggestion or something, he felt it was incumbent upon him to tell you why it wouldn't work, not why it would work. And that's about 180 degrees away from my philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, the Cavalier didn't happen probably almost completely because of Ralph Esbrandt. And it could have happened, and it would have saved the company an enormous amount of money going in, and it would have been a fantastic thing for the dealers, because the dealer would only have to tool or stock two doors,
Right.
stock two fenders, stock one bumper, instead of twice that. And the hood, same thing. The hood and the deck were interchangeable. And with all of that as a background, you probably think the car looked like a push-me, pull-me, or one that would not have any character or personality. But on the contrary, it had a hell of a lot of. It was a good-looking car. I put some sail panels on the back to kind of disguise the fact the hood and the deck were interchangeable. And of course, the grill was by itself. It was no grill in the back, and the license plate went on the back. But all of these things worked out beautifully. And if it could be criticized for anything at all, I'd be the first one to agree that was a small problem, but it could have been solved, and we damn near solved it. Had we put our shoulder to the wheel, we could have. That was the fact that the wheelbase was a little bit more than we would like to have had it be, because of the fact that there was the body is sitting directly between the wheels, the same equidistant between the center line of the front wheel and the base of the windshield, or the leading edge of the door and the leading edge of the rear door are the same distance. So you set your cradle exactly between that. You had to do that in order to make it work.
Yeah.
And the only disadvantage to what I just described is the fact that when you do that, you get a little incursion of the wheelhouse into the passenger compartment. Now, that is not an abnormal thing by any means. Many of the cars you see today have that bump, wheelhouse bump, particularly vans, and almost every van built has it. And that really was not a problem, in my view, that should have killed the car. But Ralph made such a big goddamn point of it, and he said, well, dude, nobody want to put your left foot there and your right foot on the other side, and you got this bump there. Hell, the bump wasn't bad at all. It was like having a cantaloupe or something in the right-hand corner for your left foot, the right foot. He made a big deal about where you're going to put your dimmer switch. Well, hell, you put it on the steering column, Ralph. But he made such a big issue of that. But anyway, we could have solved that thing, but he went to all the damn trouble of making up a seating buck to prove me wrong. And then he got Big Roy, who was a big guy.
Right, yeah.
And he said, now see, Roy, he said, you haven't got any place to put your left foot. Well, you did have a place to put your left foot because it wasn't that far into the center line of the vehicle. But he made such a hell of a big issue about that thing that Roy finally called me off the project and said, well, you can make a show car out of it if you want to, but he said, I don't know, I think Ralph's right. And where are you going to put the dimmer switch? Well, Jesus, at that time they didn't have dimmer switches except some of the Europeans on their stock. But
It was too...
but it really, and sure, if we dinked around with it a little bit more tread, to get the wheels out a little bit, if that became a problem that was insurmountable, which it was not, we could have had, that was the only thing that he could find wrong with that car. The dimmer switch and the fact that there was an incursion a bit into the
What was the reason for the incursion?
the wheelhouse, for turning the wheels, Maxim Johnson. And I even caught him with his hand in the candy jar on that one, because the first one he made up was way off. He was using bigger wheels and bigger tires than that car ever should have been designed around. So he finally agreed to me. He said, yeah, well, maybe it is about a half-inch off. It was more than a half-inch, but anyway, the first one he showed to Roy was off, and then when I did get Roy back to look at it after we had it down to the minimum. And if we'd also extended the wheelbase even another inch or so, every little bit helped there, but we just, Ralph didn't want to do it, so we didn't do it.
And there you have the story of the AMC Cavalier. Thanks again for watching.